Hello guys, this is Coach B with MasterChess.com, and in this video we're going to take a look at positions that involve a bishop and two connected passed pawns. And in these type of positions, white is obviously fighting for a draw since he cannot win with the king and bishop. And the ideal drawing position is when we are able to have the king in front of the passed pawns and we are able to move the bishop on the diagonal that covers the squares in front of the passed pawns. From here, there's nothing that black can do to stop white from reaching a draw. After something like king c3, let's say bishop e7, we're just going to stay on that diagonal, and eventually the pawns have to push. Then white simply takes the pawn, and there's nothing that black can do here. He's going to lose the other pawn as well, and this is a draw position. Here's another example. Here the white king is in between the two pawns, and after he moves the bishop to h6, there's nothing that black can do to stop white from reaching a draw. After e3, the bishop simply takes the pawn, let's say king e2. Here white can even let the bishop go, take the other pawn, and reach a draw this way. So next we're going to take a look at positions where the king and the two pawns is able to win. So here is the ideal position to be able to win with the two pawns. And the rule is this: if the advanced passed pawn entered the opponent's side of the board, and the king can support its path to promotion on the opposite color of the bishop, then he is able to win. And the reason why this works is because even in the most ideal position, where the black king and bishop attack the square g7 in the path of the pawn that will promote, will still not be enough to stop white from promoting. What's going to happen is white is going to push the pawn to g6. If the bishop stays on that diagonal, white will simply bring the other pawn, and now when the two pawns are next to each other, there's nothing that black can do to stop white from pushing the pawn to g7. Black here has two attackers, the king and the bishop, but white does have two defenders, the white king and the other pawn. Here, if black will take that pawn with the bishop, after white captures back with check, the black king cannot capture that pawn back, and then white will be able to promote. So the winning move here for white is king to h7. You can see that the king is on the opposite color of the bishop, and from this square the king supports the path of the advanced passed pawn to promotion. From here, nothing that black will try will work. If he moves the king to f7, for example, white simply has to push the pawn with check, and now no matter what black goes, white will simply push the pawn. If the king moves to f6, the pawn will just move to g7 and then will promote. And if the king moves to f8, white again just pushes the pawn to g7 check. After the king moves away, white will simply promote. And coming back, if black tries moving the bishop on the diagonal of the pawns, let's say bishop to d4, from here white will simply start moving the pawn to h5. Let's say bishop e5, pawn to g6, bishop d4, pawn to h6, bishop e5, pawn to g7, and after the bishop takes the pawn on h6 takes back, and there's nothing that black can do to stop white from promoting. And here even pawn to g7 right away is also winning, because after bishop takes, white can take back and black cannot have enough time to catch the other pawn from promoting. Next is another position where if white has the move, he is able to win, because black cannot prevent white from bringing the pawns next to each other behind the king and eventually moving the king to a8, from which white can simply just push the pawn to b7, checking the king, and after the king moves away, white can bring the other pawn to a7 and then push the pawn to b8 and promote. Here, after white moves the pawn to a5, there's nothing that black can do to stop white from winning. So let's take a look at all his possible moves. Let's take a look what happens if black will try to keep the bishop on the diagonal in front of the pawns. So let's say here bishop to d6. After this, white will simply push the pawn to b7 check, and here black cannot move the king to c7 as the pawn will promote with check, so he's going to have to move away to d7, and after that white will still promote. Bishop takes the queen, and after white will take the bishop, there's nothing that black can do to stop him from promoting. Another thing that black can try here is moving the bishop to d4, pinning the passed pawn on b6. Here white will simply move the king to a8, And if black is going to try to take the pawn on b6, white will simply capture back, and now there's nothing that black can do to stop that pawn from promoting. Black will have to move back, the pawn will push, and then will promote. And coming back from the beginning, the last try that black has is to try to take the king and go after the backward pawn. So let's say king to d7. Here white will simply move the king to b7, gaining the opposition, also on the opposite color of the bishop. And now black has two tries. If he moves the bishop to c3, attacking the backward pawn, white will simply just start pushing it, a6, bishop a5, a7, and then after bishop takes the pawn, the other pawn will promote. And the other try that black has here is trying to attack the other pawn, the pawn on b6, with bishop to d4. From here, white will simply push the pawn on a5 to a6. After bishop takes the pawn on b6, white can simply capture. After black moves the king to c8 and white pushes the pawn to a7, black is blocked and cannot reach the pawn, and he has to retreat and the pawn will promote. So these are the two scenarios where the king and the two pawns are able to win the game. So next we're going to take a look at the positions where the king and bishop are able to achieve a draw even if the king is not in front of the pawn. There are three types of positions that use the same drawing technique called the tail hook defense. In this defense, one of the pieces attacks the tail of the opponent's position, which is the backward pawn, while the other piece keeps an eye on the advanced pawn to prevent it from promoting. And here's our first position, where the kings are in diagonal opposition and white is not in front of the passed pawns. In this position, if white is trying to get in front of the pawns, moving the king to c1, this will be a terrible mistake, because after this, black will be able to move the king to a2, blocking white from coming in front of the pawns, but also reaching the desired winning position. Here, black is actually winning now, and there's nothing that white can do. If white starts attacking black's pawns, those pawns will start marching, let's say bishop to c5. The next pawn will march to b3, and now the bishop has to come on the diagonal in front of the advanced pawn to stop him from moving. But after pawn to a3, that pawn will still march, something like bishop e5. The pawn will march to b2 with check. After we take the pawn, black takes back with check, and then we have to move out of the way, and then black will promote. So coming back from the beginning, the way we're going to be able to draw this position is by the tail hook method. Here, the bishop will start attacking the pawns right away with bishop to b6. This will prevent black from moving his king, because if he does that, we're simply going to take that pawn, and after pawn to b3, the bishop will come on c3, and just staying on that diagonal will prevent that pawn from moving, or if it does move, the bishop will take the pawn and achieve a draw this way. Coming back, if the black king will move to b2 instead, we're simply going to take the pawn on a5. After b3, here's our key move, bishop to b4. No matter which side the black king will go on, the bishop will come and cover the diagonal in front of the pawn. So here black, all he's got is king to a2, and after that bishop to c3 will secure the diagonal and prevent the pawn from moving to b2, as it's going to capture it. So after bishop to b6, the best play for black here is moving the pawn to a4. After this, the bishop will attack the pawn on b4. After this, if black moves the pawn to a3, white will move the king to c1, entering the square of the pawn. And from here, if the pawn moves to a2, the bishop will simply come to d4. After this, let's say king to a3, we're going to be able to come with the bishop to b2 check. After king moves away, bishop to d4, just staying on that diagonal. King to c4, attacking the bishop, bishop to b2. Just keep staying on the diagonal. And if black is just going to push the other pawn, all we have to do is just keep staying on that diagonal. After something like king to b4, now our king could even come to b2, and this position is a draw. In our next position, the kings are in horizontal opposition, also called shouldering, and this is probably the most common type of position you'll run into. Here, the tail hook defense method also works. So after bishop to d8, attacking the tail of the pawns, which is the backward pawn, black will move the pawn to a4. After that, we're going to start attacking the pawn on b4. Let's say pawn to a3. Here we could actually even take the pawn on b4. If black takes the bishop, white will simply come to c2. And after a2, white will simply move the king to b2, and now that pawn is lost. And coming back, if black doesn't take the bishop and just starts marching that pawn, white will simply bring the bishop to c3, and taking control of this diagonal will be enough to secure a draw. And here's our last type of position, where black cannot achieve diagonal or horizontal opposition, but if he has the move, he is able to achieve a draw. This type of position draws if the advanced pawn is promoting on the same color as the bishop, and if the pawns are separated by one rank, which will give black enough time to attack the tail of the pawn before it will promote. The correct play here is king to d7. After this, if white moves the pawn to b7, the king will go to c6. Pawn to a5, king to b5, attacking the pawn from the rear. Pawn to a6, the bishop just has to stay on that diagonal. Bishop to d6, and if white here promotes the pawn, the bishop can simply take it, and if white captures the bishop, black can simply take the backward pawn. And if white tries not to take the bishop to promote the other pawn, black can simply come to a5, and now white either takes the bishop or pushes the pawn. If he takes the bishop, black takes the pawn, and if he pushes the pawn, obviously black will just take the pawn with the bishop. And coming back after king d7, if white pushes the backward pawn right away, let's say pawn to a5, black simply needs to move the king to c6. And here, after white moves the pawn to a6, black has to be careful. He has to move the bishop to d4, pinning the pawn on b6. And from here, white doesn't have that many options. He can push the pawn to b7. He can move the king to b7. So all he's got is maybe moving the king to b8. And after this, bishop will just take the pawn on b6. And as soon as the pawn moves to a7, the bishop will take it as well. Coming back, if black does make the mistake of attacking the pawns from the rear here, well, here white can simply move the king to b7, reaching the opposite color of the bishop and supporting the pawns to promote, and there's nothing that black can do now to stop it. The only try that he has is moving the bishop to c8, but after this, white will move the pawn to a7, attacking the bishop, and if that bishop retreats, the pawn will promote. If the bishop takes the pawn on a7, the pawn will take back, and now black cannot stop white from promoting. So far, all the positions we looked at deal with pawns on the side of the board, but this drawing technique actually works for pawns in the center of the board as well. So here, with white to move, if white moves the king to e6, you can see the kings are in horizontal opposition, and we can start the tail hook defense method here. So we're going to move the bishop to d2, attacking the pawn on f4, which is the tail of this position. After f5, we're going to go to bishop to c3, attacking the pawn on e5. And now if the pawn pushes to f6, we want to make sure that we keep the dragon by its tail. In other words, we want to make sure that the bishop stays on this diagonal, attacking the pawn on e5. What we're trying to do is trying to prevent white from reaching the square f7, where he also guards the promotion squares for the pawn on e5 on the opposite color of the bishop. If we keep the bishop on that same diagonal, let's say bishop to d4, white cannot move to the desired square f7. If he does that, then we're simply going to take the pawn on e5, and we're also attacking the other pawn. If the white king attacks our bishop, we could simply take the pawn and we got our draw this way. But if we keep the bishop on d4, then white will simply push the pawn to f7, as he doesn't want to lose the backward pawn. And now we're going to move the bishop to c5. We want to make sure that we prevent white from reaching the square f8 and promoting. So now the bishop will cover that square. And from here, white will move the king to f6. And here's another crucial moment that we need to remember with the pawns on the center of the board. We need to move the bishop to f8 here. If we don't do that, let's say we keep the bishop on the diagonal, bishop to b4, white will move the pawn to e6. And now black cannot reach the square d7 with the king to prevent that pawn from moving, since the pawn on e6 attacks that square. So keeping the bishop on that diagonal will not help. After e7, there's not much that we can do to prevent the promotion. We cannot sacrifice the bishop, as white will take that bishop and promote on the next move. If we bring the king close, then he's simply going to be able to promote with check. However, coming back after bishop to f8, and white pushes the pawn on e6, our king can come to d6, and now there's not much that white can do here. If he wants to hold on to his pawn, all he's got is king to f5. And after this, the bishop could just come back to e7, and now white has to let go of that pawn with king to g6, And now we're simply going to take that pawn, and even if he moves the king to g7, our bishop just has to stay on this diagonal, and we will be able to capture the pawn and get a draw that way. And coming back from the very beginning, if white, instead of moving the king to e6, where he's reaching horizontal opposition, he's going to move the king to f6, black can still achieve a draw. But black has to be super careful. The drawing move here is king to d5. Black is going to try to take advantage of the fact that the pawn on e5 is pinned to the white king and is going to be able to capture that pawn. Now there's not much that white can do. All he's got is moving the pawn to f5, from which we're going to be able to take it with check. And after the king moves to g6, the bishop covers the diagonal for the pawn on the f-file, and as soon as the pawn moves to f6, the bishop will just take it. And if instead white will move the king here to f7, black can simply just capture the pawn on e5, and after white captures back, the king can take that pawn and get a draw this way. But after king to f6, if black moves the king to d7, this would be a terrible mistake, because now we've allowed white to reach the square f7 on the opposite color of the bishop. From the square, he is guarding the path of the promotion for the pawn on the e-file, and we are not going to be able to stop him. Okay, and thank you so much for watching this video, and good luck applying this tail hook defense in your future games. If you liked my video, please subscribe and don't forget to check out my new website, masteryourchess.com, where you can learn, practice, test, and master your chess knowledge.